Imagine waking up to the sound of bombs and gunfire. The walls are shaking, the ground is trembling, and outside, soldiers are hunting down civilians, raping women, and slaughtering entire families. Survivors who hid inside churches later recalled the relentless thunderstorm of gunfire, shot after shot, bombs after bombs, until suddenly it gave way to an eerie silence. And when they finally stepped out, the church floors were covered in blood and bodies, silent and still. 100,000 civilians butchered. For 28 days, Manila burned. The streets flooded with blood. And by the time the battle ended, the majestic city, once called the Pearl of the Orient, was reduced to ashes. This was not a war movie. This was not a nightmare. This was Manila in 1945. And what happened in Manila 80 years ago was not just a battle. It was one of the worst massacres in human history. But I bet most of you have never heard about it. Mabuhay or in Kapampangan luwid kayo. Welcome to my channel. It's me, Kirby Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. And in today's video, we're diving into one of the darkest chapters and most forgotten tragedies, not just in the Philippines, but in world history. The Battle of Manila in 1945. The Battle of Manila, fought between February 3rd and March 3rd, 1945, was not just another battle in World War II. It was one of the most brutal urban battles in human history. For 4 weeks, Manila became hell on earth. The Japanese Imperial Army unleashed systemic massacres, turning homes, churches, and hospitals into sites of bloodbath. Meanwhile, the United States bombarded the city into oblivion, reducing it to ruins and killing thousands. By the end, over 100,000 civilians died. Manila was unrecognizable, its people, culture, and history erased, all under the banner of liberation. Yet this tragedy remains forgotten. Manila's fate was sealed before the battle even began. The Americans expected a quick victory, a swift liberation, but instead Manila ended up drowning in blood.
I shall return.
These three words were not just a promise, but what followed was far from salvation. In October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur stepped onto the shores of Leyte, finally making good on his vow to retake the Philippines from Japanese occupation. But his return came after years of abandonment. Left to fight and survive on their own since 1942, Filipinos endured massacres, starvation, and war. Yet they never gave in. They never gave up. In fact, Filipino guerrillas never stopped fighting to liberate the Philippines. By early 1945, American forces were pushing deeper into Luzon. MacArthur's eyes were fixed on the ultimate prize, the capital Manila, and he expected a swift victory. After all, Japanese forces had abandoned other cities without a fight. On February 3rd, US troops entered Manila. American forces quickly reached the University of Santo Tomas, freeing hundreds of Allied prisoners. Optimism was high, but this optimism wouldn't last. So what went wrong? Why didn't the Japanese retreat like they had in other cities? Retreat. That was the order from General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of Japanese forces in the Philippines. He knew the war was lost and ordered his forces to withdraw into the mountains of Luzon. But not everyone obeyed his command. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi had different plans. Defying orders to retreat, he commanded his 16,000 naval Japanese troops to dig in and fight to the death. They barricaded buildings, planted mines along the streets, and turned Manila into a citywide death trap. Every bridge destroyed, every escape route sealed. No one could get in or out. Expecting a swift victory, American forces quickly realized that instead, they're walking into an urban slaughterhouse. But they were not the only ones caught in the middle of the chaos. Over 1 million Filipino civilians were about to endure a nightmare beyond imagination. Imagine being trapped in a city where every neighborhood becomes a battlefield. That was Manila in February 1945. My own lolo or grandfather was a medical student at UST when the battle began, and he was not a soldier. But in those days, everyone was pulled into the war, whether they wanted it or not. And when the wounded poured into the university, students like my lolo found themselves on the front lines, not of battle, but of survival. Classrooms became operating rooms. They worked under constant shelling, with more wounded arriving every hour. And throughout the city, 1 million civilians were trapped. Bridges were gone. There was no way out. Even their homes offered no safety. Some survivors recalled running through the burning streets, clutching their babies and children, desperate to escape. They remembered the screams of their neighbors from inside their homes, trapped in the flames, with no way out. With no military targets left, the Japanese unleashed their fury on civilians, massacring thousands, while relentless American bombardment turned entire districts to dust. By March, over 100,000 civilians were dead. Manila, once the jewel of Asia, was nothing but ruins. Manila's destruction was not just a military catastrophe, it was a humanitarian disaster. In fact, it was one of the darkest atrocities in human history, yet it remains one of the least remembered tragedies of World War II. Manila was supposed to be liberated, but instead, it became a slaughterhouse. By February 9th, the battle had plunged into pure horror. With nowhere left to run, Japanese forces unleashed one of the worst massacres of World War II. Entire families were butchered in their homes. Soldiers rampaged through Malate, Ermita, and Intramuros, dragging civilians from shelters, executing them in the streets. No one was spared. Women, children, even the unborn met unthinkable fates. The killings were relentless. Homes, hospitals, churches, once places of safety and refuge, became mass graves. By the thousands, civilians were rounded up, shot, or burned alive. But this was not just random violence. The Japanese had methods, calculated, deliberate, grotesque methods that turned Manila into a waking nightmare. There was no mercy, no escape. Babies were torn from their mothers' arms and impaled on bayonets. Women were raped, then dismembered. Priests and nuns burned alive inside churches, their screams lost in the flames. The Japanese forces didn't just kill, they made sure their victims suffered first. Along the Pasig River, civilians were bound together, thrown into the water, and machine-gunned as they struggled to stay afloat. Survivors later recalled bodies drifting downstream along the river, faces frozen in terror. One elderly survivor whispered, "Every night, I hear the voices calling for help." In the streets, severed heads stood on spikes, a brutal reminder that even surrendering meant nothing. Many Filipinos were forced to dig their own graves. Others watched their families massacred before meeting the same fate. The brutality was systematic, it was intentional, and it was everywhere. But in some places, the horrors had no limits. The terror and the bloodshed was beyond words, beyond imagination. Some of Manila's most sacred places became execution chambers. At St. Paul's College, Japanese forces stormed a convent, raping and murdering nuns before setting the building ablaze, with their bodies still inside. At De La Salle College, more than 70 civilians, including women, children, and Christian brothers, were massacred in cold blood inside the chapel. At the Red Cross headquarters, doctors and nurses who had sworn to save lives were tortured and executed. Their neutrality was ignored, and even places of worship were not spared. At Manila Cathedral and San Agustin Church, priests and worshippers were butchered where they stood. In hospitals like PGH and San Juan de Dios, the wounded were dragged from their beds, then shot. No one was safe. But the horror was not confined to these buildings. Entire neighborhoods became mass graves. In Malate and Ermita, families were rounded up. Men, women, and children executed on sight or burned alive in their homes. Along the Pasig River, civilians were bound together, shot, and dumped into the water. Their bodies drifted for days. The streets ran red. Manila had become a graveyard. But even after this nightmare, the horror was not over. As brutal as the Japanese were, the American liberation would bring devastation on a scale no one was prepared for. Manila was a city under siege, but what many don't realize is that the Americans had a choice. Unlike in Paris, where Allied forces worked diligently to carefully preserve the historic city, MacArthur chose brute force. Unknown to many, he had alternatives, like tactical bypassing or a siege, to starve out the Japanese, strategies that had worked successfully in other battles without obliterating the capital. But MacArthur rejected them. Instead, he ordered full-scale urban warfare, knowing it would level Manila and kill thousands of civilians. And he justified this by pointing to Japanese fanaticism, their brutalities, and their use of human shields. But make no mistake, this level of devastation was not inevitable. It was a choice, and it cost 100,000 innocent civilian lives. Historians estimate that while Japanese forces carried out mass executions, up to 40% of civilian casualties actually came from U.S. artillery fire. MacArthur's decision to unleash overwhelming firepower prioritized military victory, but at the cost of thousands of trapped civilians. And as a result, 1 million innocent Filipinos were caught in the crossfire. Desperate to retake Manila, Douglas MacArthur launched an all-out assault, but the Japanese had dug in, refusing to surrender. They fought street by street, forcing the Allied forces into brutal close-quarters combat. And as Manila burned, it wasn't just military targets that are being destroyed. The numbers are staggering. Over 1,000 tons of artillery shells pummeled Manila, reducing the once magnificent city to smoldering ruins. Historical accounts describe hospitals reduced to rubble, hallways filled with bodies, entire wards turned into graveyards. Relentless artillery fire obliterated medical facilities, trapping the wounded and those trying to save them. Survivors later testified no one was spared, not the doctors, not the patients. American forces bombarded entire districts like Malate, Ermita, and Intramuros. Streets once lined with colonial-era buildings, churches, and hospitals were reduced to rubble. U.S. commanders claimed the destruction was unavoidable, that the Japanese had turned every city block into a fortress. But thousands of civilians were still trapped inside. Firestorms swept through entire neighborhoods, leaving nothing but ashes. Homes, businesses, and historical landmarks vanished in the flames. For those who survived the Japanese massacres, the American bombings brought little relief, only more death and destruction. Yet, even as Manila burned, Filipinos refused to give up. Doctors and nurses, including medical students like my lolo, continued treating the wounded in makeshift hospitals, despite dwindling supplies, working with whatever little they had left. Families pulled strangers from the rubble, refusing to leave anyone behind. Outgunned and outnumbered, guerrilla fighters risked their lives to rescue civilians. And amid all of this destruction, Filipinos didn't just survive, they saved others. But to truly understand the scale of this battle, the scale of this tragedy, we need to go back not just before the battle, but before the war itself. Because Manila was not just a city, it was history, heritage, culture, and people, all destroyed and reduced to ashes in just 1 month. Before the war, before the bombs, and before the fire, Manila was a city of beauty and majesty. Known as the Pearl of the Orient, it was one of Asia's most cosmopolitan cities. For centuries, Manila flourished as a thriving center of trade and a crossroads of cultures. Long before the Europeans arrived, it was ruled by the Rajas and the Lakans of Luzon. In fact, merchants from across Asia and the Muslim world sailed into the ports of Manila Bay. In 1571, the pre-colonial walled city of Manila was burned down by the Spaniards, and above it they built Intramuros, a walled city of churches, fortresses, and palaces. 2 centuries later, in 1762, the British invaded, looting and burning the city in a violent occupation that lasted 2 years. But Manila rose again. Now fast forward to the 1900s. Under American rule, Manila transformed yet again. Escolta became the Wall Street of Southeast Asia, lined with Art Deco skyscrapers and thriving with commerce, while the National Archives and National Library safeguarded centuries of history, priceless records of our motherland's past, identity, and heritage. But in 1945, all of it vanished. Manila's history was turned to smoke. Our people's past was lost in the flames. The National Library reduced to ash, the National Archives wiped out, the written history of the Filipino people gone in an instant. Even Intramuros, the walled city that had stood for centuries, was bombed into oblivion. Nearly 1 million books, manuscripts, and historical records burned to ashes. Entire collections of Filipino legal, political, and social history erased in the flames. And with them vanished centuries of family histories, ancestral knowledge, and the legacies of pre-colonial societies that had survived colonial rule. We may never know the full extent of what was lost. Trade records from our ties with China, Japan, India, the Muslim world, and others. Indigenous genealogies stretching back centuries, long before the Spaniards even arrived. Manuscripts documenting pre-colonial laws and societies. Entire libraries, ancestral heirlooms, and irreplaceable artifacts, all gone in a single firestorm. Many of the last remaining records of our ancestors, many written in our ancient indigenous scripts, were turned to smoke. Throughout history, conquerors erased identities by burning books. In Manila, history was not just burned, it was caught in the crossfire and lost to the flames of war. But if Manila was once one of the greatest cities in Asia, then why is this tragedy, this destruction barely remembered? Because if you think about it, Manila was not just burned, it was buried from memory. 100,000 civilians dead, a city obliterated beyond recognition. Yet compared to Hiroshima or Nanjing, Manila remains one of the least known tragedies of World War II. And yet, very few wartime atrocities were well documented as thoroughly as the one in Manila. Thousands of photographs, eyewitness testimonies, war crime reports, and military records paint a clear, vivid picture of the horrors of those 28 days. The destruction of Manila was mapped in U.S. Army archives, detailed in post-war trials, and preserved in books and survivor accounts. In fact, there is no shortage of evidence, only a shortage of recognition. By the late 1940s, the world had moved on. The United States, now focused on the Cold War, saw the Philippines as a key ally against communism. The Philippines, newly independent and ravaged by war, relied on American aid and couldn't afford to dwell on the fact that Manila was obliterated by American bombs. That truth was inconvenient for both sides. The Americans framed it as a heroic liberation, yet the suffering of the Filipino people was often reduced to a footnote. But the silence was not just from the West. Japan too has barely acknowledged what truly happened. When people think of Japanese war crimes, they often think of Nanjing or Bataan, but Manila, barely a footnote. After the war, Japan rebuilt its economy and re-established diplomatic ties across Asia. Japan issued partial apologies for Nanjing, the Bataan Death March, and the Comfort Women, though many surviving Comfort Women in both Korea and the Philippines argue that they were never enough. But for Manila's massacre, nothing. No large-scale war tribunals, no formal apologies, no reparations specifically for the victims in the Battle of Manila. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, the man who orchestrated Manila's massacre, died before he could face justice. General Yamashita was executed in 1946, but for broader war crimes across the Philippines, not specifically Manila. For Japan, Manila was a reminder of its military's final, desperate brutality in World War II. For the US, it was easier to call it a Japanese war crime than to confront the true cost of liberation, 100,000 innocent Filipinos to be precise. And just like that, the world moved on. The scars of war never truly faded, but unlike other cities that rose from the ashes of ruins, Manila was left broken. Warsaw, Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, all were devastated by World War II, but they were rebuilt and their history carefully preserved and remembered. Manila was not as lucky. After the war, instead of restoring the city's Spanish Filipino and American-era heritage, or even following Daniel Burnham's Grand Master Plan, post-war leaders prioritized modernization over preservation. Grand plazas, stately mansions, colonial palaces, Art Deco buildings, majestic boulevards, greeneries, and sprawling parks gone. They were replaced by highways, high-rises, and endless concrete. Intramuros, the heart of Old Manila, sat in ruins for decades. Escolta, once Southeast Asia's busiest commercial hub, was left to decay. The city, once called the Pearl of the Orient, or even the Paris of Asia, became unrecognizable. Warsaw's historic core was meticulously rebuilt. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were also rebuilt as symbols of peace, while Paris was carefully spared from destruction. But Manila lost more than just buildings. It lost its very soul. 100,000 innocent lives lost, a city reduced to ruins, a tragedy the world barely remembers. But survival is not the same as justice, and rebuilding does not always bring back what was taken. For far too long, the suffering of Manila has been buried in silence. It took 50 years before survivors and descendants were able to build the Memorare Manila 1945 monument in 1995. Yet even today, Manila's massacre and destruction remains barely acknowledged outside the Philippines. Manila rose from the ashes of war, not because justice was served, but because of the resilience of its people. Survivors rebuilt, families endured. A city once shattered stands tall again because its people refuse to give up. Yet the scars remain, not just in the ruins that were never rebuilt, but in the memories of those who lived through the nightmare. And today we honor and remember them not just as victims, but as heroes, as survivors, as the very soul of a city that refused to be erased into oblivion. And as long as we remember, the soul of Manila lives on, not just in the streets and buildings, but in the unwavering spirit of its people, our people. To be honest, no single video can fully capture the Battle of Manila, but together we can make sure that it's never forgotten. Together we can keep the memories of our people alive. So if your family has stories, or if there's something that I missed, or anything that you want to add, let us know in the comments below. Because this tragedy was not just about a battle that happened 80 years ago, it was about our people. So let us make sure that our voices are heard. And if you want to learn more and explore about our people's histories, cultures, and everything in between, please check out my other videos on this channel. In fact, our next video is all about Filipino women in World War II, so stay tuned. Maraming salamat po o in Kapampangan, dakal pong salamat kay Kongan, inilokano agya manaklawnay. See you next time when Tagalog kita kits in Kapampangan, Mikitix and in Binisaya, kita aita.